Welcome to Politically Basic. I'm your host, Kyle Campbell. We're breaking down the basics of all political issues and current political events so that you get to decide. Today, we're lucky to hear straight from a constitutional attorney about the state that arguably is pushing the limits of the state constitution, putting forward radical legislation on the reg. It's Phil Mauriello Jr., constitutional attorney, author, and host of the California Underground podcast. He knows better than most what's going on in politics in probably the most influential state in the nation. Phil, thank you so much for being on the show with me today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, here on Politically Basic, we break down the basics. So let's kick things right off with what is it to be a constitutional attorney?
It could mean a whole bunch of things. Specifically in any context here in California is, well, let me start off by saying when it comes to constitutional attorney, there are multiple constitutions. There are state constitutions, and then there's obviously the U.S. Constitution, which everybody knows about. That's the most famous with the First Amendment, Second Amendment, all that stuff. But California also has their own constitution here, so it's important that states and politicians and anybody in elected office or in government for that matter abide by what is in the U.S. Constitution. And here in California, they have to also listen to the California Constitution. So anybody who violates any of those terms can be brought into court, and the court can say, okay, you violated this. Whatever you did was wrong, whether it was legislation, whether it was some sort of regulation, or whether it's some sort of act that they're trying to propose. Any of that stuff can be deemed as unconstitutional under the U.S. Constitution, which is our federal constitution, or the state constitution. And sort of that's what constitutional attorneys do, is they kind of hold these elected leaders and these people in government accountable, making sure that they aren't violating that, which is the rights of the people.
Yeah, I read somewhere that if California was sovereign, if we were our own country, that the state constitution would be one of the longest in the world, with something like over 500 amendments.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The process here in California is something unique. There are definitely different states that try and do this. They don't have sort of the, I guess, as democratic process as we have. Back in the early 1900s, it was actually a progressive Republican governor who had put forth this idea that people should be able to, their citizens should be able to amend the Constitution or change their government just by a straight democratic vote on these propositions. We still see that today. Every year, every 2 years, we see a slew of propositions that make it to your ballot. Most people don't even know what they are. Most people they've never even read them. Maybe they've seen like a commercial or something about them, the ones that are the most popular. But yeah, every year we vote on propositions. Propositions then get added as amendments to the Constitution. And yeah, so if you were to like look at the actual California Constitution, the amount of amendments to this Constitution is pretty wild because yeah, every 2 years we're adding new stuff to it.
Does that make it harder to be an attorney here?
There's a lot that, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of amendments, but it's easier to focus on sort of the major provisions of the California Constitution in terms of privacy is probably the biggest one. Privacy is a big one in the California Constitution that's not actually protected under the U.S. Constitution. Freedom of speech is actually, ironically, based on case law here in California. Actually, freedom of speech in California under our Constitution is actually broader than the U.S. Constitution, which you wouldn't know it by the way. A lot of dissenting voices are always kind of tapped down here in California. But that's always an interesting one, is when they say, oh, it's First Amendment, and our freedom of speech in California is actually broader. So it is, when you're going into a case, you're looking for a specific provision. Thankfully, with the age of computers, it's easy to just hop in and search for exactly what you're looking for in your Constitution to argue for.
That's so interesting. I'm not sure that I knew that. How is freedom of speech broader in California? Like, what can you say or express in California that would be more restricted in other states?
It's tough to give you an example, but in terms of our case law, they have continuously held in California from the California Supreme Court that the right to freedom of speech here is even broader than the U.S. First Amendment. So, in terms of specific examples, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I just
Mm.
remember the one case that I was working on, and when I was reading it and learning more about it, I was actually flabbergasted to find out that, yeah, freedom of speech is more broad here in California than it is under the U.S. Constitution. And the Supreme Court here in California, again, there's a U.S. Supreme Court, and then there's our California Supreme Court. California Supreme Court has held that, yeah, freedom of speech is broader. Um, I think that has a lot to do with specifically probably inflammatory language or insults or um, for example, there was one case I was working on, and I don't want to get really into like the nitty gritty of it. Is basically when you file a lawsuit infringing on someone's right to freedom of speech, um, you can file this thing back called an anti-slap, basically saying your lawsuit infringes on my right to practice my right to freedom of speech. And in doing so, as some people who were commenting on a politician, the law was basically you can say really whatever you want about a political figure here in California. It's pretty much open season. And some of the examples were a little offensive. I don't know if I want to go into them, but it basically said, like, look, you can say whatever you want about public figures, as long as it's not intentionally defamatory. It's pretty broad and wide open. So that's an example of how broad it is here in California.
That's so surprising. But political leadership in California is giving citizens and residents plenty to talk about and potentially complain about. So it's good that they still have the right to do that. Phil, you're best known for the California Underground podcast. Tell us a little bit about that. What is it? How'd you get going with that?
Yeah, it was around 2018. I I kind of can't, and this goes into what the name is I kind of had this feeling of like when you're here in California, it's predominantly blue. That's no secret. Everyone knows it's predominantly deep blue. But it's always interesting, like when you're out and about and you kind of meet somebody else who maybe aligns with you, maybe they're right of center. And all of a sudden, you tiptoe around taxes, and you go, "Oh yeah, taxes kind of really suck," and blah blah blah. And, oh, gas is too high, and da da da. And you start to go down that road of like, well, maybe we think like each other, maybe we're on the same page. And then once you got to know like someone who was on the same page as you started to go, oh, it's like we're all part of this like underground society. Like we all know who everybody is, but we want to talk to each other about what we really think about California. So that's sort of where the name came from, is this idea of like, yeah, there's a bunch of people here in California who do not just subscribe to whatever the prominent Bay Area liberal Democrat is saying. There's a lot of people who are independent, they're moderate, they're right leaning, they're libertarian, maybe they're moderate Democrats. So that was sort of the idea, was to give people a place to go to and listen to this podcast and stay updated and say, yeah, I'm not the only person. Like there's other people out here in California who think like I am, and I think that's powerful because there's power in numbers. Like if you feel like you're alone in a state, maybe you don't get engaged. Maybe you feel like there's no hope for you in doing anything and you just, let the Democrats run wild. Um, but I think if there's a belief like, yeah, there's a bunch of us out here and we could actually make change, then you can actually make some change here in California, maybe start turning it back around.
Hmm. Yeah, you've had a lot of success with it, and congratulations on everything that you're doing and the growth that you've had. California is a strange beast, right? She's
Mhm.
enormous. 40 million people live in California, 22 million voters. There are twice as many registered Democrats as Republicans. It's always fascinating to me to look at the map when it's colored red versus blue. And I'm sure you've done this many times. I mean, it looks like it's 98% red. And then just
Yeah.
this little strip of coastal towns is blue, yet you've got about a 65, 66% voter population voting Democrat. And now, over the last, I'd say, two presidential elections, there's been this sort of groundswell of more conservatives speaking out. And it's so interesting. You talk about how you started this California underground and you feeling like you had to kind of, as maybe more right of center, operate in an underground way. There's sort of this subculture in California that I've really noticed where people who are conservatives, if they think someone else is, we always joke about, like, people joke about whispering to each other, like, I'm
Hmm.
conservative or something like that, and finding each other and
Yeah.
linking up. Like, you're people who do align with the Republican Party or who are conservative or more right leaning feel like they have to tread very, very carefully. But that's millions and millions of people. But it's a fascinating state. It's bellwether for sure. A lot of legislation and policy that is passed in California affects what happens in the rest of the nation. You understand California better than most. It's so important to pay attention to what's going on there. What are your thoughts on changes that you've seen since the last presidential election, really since COVID, in
Hmm.
political parties and voters across the state? And what other states get wind of, which seems to be a real growing discontent with current leadership in California?
Yeah, I can tell you firsthand. I saw a marketed difference. So when I started this in 2018, like most podcasts, and this is what I tell all, people who start a podcast, I tell them, consistency is number one thing. Don't give up. And in the beginning, it's not going to be super glamorous. There might not be a lot of people listening. But when I started in 2018, there weren't that many people who really cared about California politics. Like you said, oh, we have to pay attention to what's going on in Sacramento or what city ordinance is being passed in San Diego or LA. And people were just kind of like, yeah, whatever, okay. What's going on with the presidential race? But when COVID hit, I think that changed. That was like a seismic shift in how people viewed politics. And we've had a lot of guests on. Most recently, we had Andrew Hayes on, who has been on school board. He's running for state assembly. And he said as well, he noticed a large shift in voters and citizens being engaged on like the local level. And I think COVID, what that did was it woke a lot of people up to the sense of, well, who's this county supervisor guy? And why is he telling me I can't go out to a restaurant? And why is this county supervisor person telling me I can't send my kids to school? And then people started to get involved in like, well, what's a county supervisor? A lot of people before COVID, they wouldn't be able to tell you like one person on their county supervisor board. And now you talk to a lot of people and they're well versed in like county supervisors and like what's the strategy of getting this person on and this person. It's like you never saw that prior to COVID. So the silver lining to COVID was that a lot of people kind of started to pay attention to what's going on with their local politics. And I think school boards has definitely been one of the interesting ones, especially with the school closures and how school boards kind of handled COVID. And we've seen sort of now this tug of war between like Sacramento and local school boards. A lot of people got involved in their local school boards and said, okay, I don't like what you're doing. We're going to vote you out. We're going to put in people that we believe in. These people then came in and they said, well, hold on. Now we have this parental rights issue regarding trans students. We're going to implement this parental right notification. Sacramento didn't like that. They came out with AB 1955, which is probably one of the most controversial bills to come out of Sacramento in a
Mm-hmm.
long time. But that's sort of what's happening now is you never before saw in Sacramento this kind of fight with local school boards. Like this is where we're at now is Sacramento is trying to tamp down this resistance. Really, that's what it is. It's this change in the seed. It's the change in the sentiment of voters. Is they're changing things at their local level, and Sacramento is trying to tamp it down as fast as possible. Um, to some success, but I think in what they're doing might come back to hurt them because now it's evident that Sacramento doesn't want you to vote in for your own local politics or your own local elected officials. So yeah, there's definitely a groundswell of people changing how they're looking at local politics. So that's been exciting to see, and hopefully it just keeps continuing and people start paying attention. They don't give up anytime soon.
I think you're right. It seems like the culture and the kind of thoughts and feelings of opinions of Californians are really shifting since COVID, and a lot of things were exposed, right? There had been a government at work that really had very little transparency and was enjoying that, and things really shifted. So it's so fascinating to hear from you on that. And I want to talk leadership. I want to talk to you about Governor Gavin Newsom.
Mhm.
He has a record issue and he's got a popularity issue. A lot of the research that I do really taps into what people are truly, actually, and factually thinking, not just what mainstream media or some of these larger polling agencies are reporting, but what people are really saying. And I'm having a really hard time finding anybody who likes him, thinks he's doing a good job, supports him. It's pretty bad, and it doesn't seem like he's helping himself out at all recently. Now, there was one recall effort to remove and replace him a few years back. There seemed to be a lot of energy around that. A number of people discussing it, a lot of people signing the recall effort. There was a lot of news about checking those signatures, and it seemed like it had a real shot. It failed. Newsom didn't seem worried at all. He took a couple media interviews where he really brushed it off. And now here we go again, and there's a second recall effort. And I'm really interested in your thoughts on all of this, and also why no one's hearing really much of anything about the second recall effort. What do you think?
Um, well, I'm going to be absolutely frank. The reason you're not hearing about the second recall effort is because they're not doing anything. The past two reporting periods, they haven't reported any gathering any signatures. They've raised a ton of money. They've spent very little of it. And yeah, you don't hear a lot about it. It's contrasted to the first recall where I would hear a lot of people, followers putting out this news would say to me, "Oh, I used to see these recall petitions at my grocery store or wherever I was going. I saw these recall petitions everywhere." I'm not seeing it this time around. I'm not sure really who's behind this, whether it's just, and this is something that we talk a lot about on our podcast, is you have to also be a very quizzical or kind of you kind of have to look at people who pretend like they're on your side in California because people are desperate in California, right? They're looking for somebody to come in and be a savior. They're looking for someone to come in and be that change. And a lot of people tap into that and make a lot of money and they gain a lot of popularity and then they don't end up actually doing anything. And I think that's a shame because they're kind of taking advantage of people in California who want to see something better. They're looking for solutions to their problems. Um, and you got to be very quizzical about this and very critical about people who come in and say they're on your team or they're in your political party because they may just be going the way the wind is blowing to make themselves a good chunk of cash, or maybe they want to up their social media presence so then they can turn that into notoriety and fame. So in terms of this second recall, we've been keeping an eye on it, and we're kind of confused as to who's really behind this and why are they doing this. If they haven't reported any signatures, what's going on here? But they've raised a ton of money, which is good for them, but they just haven't spent any of it. They're not really going out there and getting signatures. In terms of the first recall, I thought there was a real opportunity that it could have been closer. Polls going up into about a month in, like, around mid-August, the polls were like, this is kind of a coin cost. Newsom could be he could be recalled. Whatever your thoughts on Larry Elder are, I think he's a very knowledgeable guy and stuff like that. Unfortunately, I think his entrance into the recall actually ended up hurting the recall because he became the thing that they were all looking for. He became the Trump candidate, which Trump is unfortunately very toxic in California. Just the mere mention of Trump in California, it gets people to like revile you. So Larry Elder like entering the race, I think that gave Newsom exactly what he was looking for, which was, Larry Elder's the Trump guy. Here's pictures of him with Trump, and here we go. We want a Trump guy to be governor, and that kind of flipped the race, and then that's when Newsom ran away with it. But before then, it was actually really close, and I think Newsom was sweating it out a little bit as to like I could get recalled here, and maybe someone like a Kevin Faulconer could become the Republican governor. So there definitely is dissatisfaction here in the state for Gavin Newsom. We see it firsthand. A lot of people outside of the state don't see it. We all know he's gearing up for 2028. He's got that huge PAC, that Campaign for Democracy, which has raised a ton of money. And the one thing I'll say about Gavin Newsom, we say about him on the show, is, don't discount Gavin Newsom. He is a shrewd and smart and tactical politician. He didn't get where he is because he's some dummy who like failed upwards. He's a shrewd politician. He knows he wants to run for president one day, and he knows that what he's doing right now is getting his national profile out there with this campaign for democracy. Um, and he's built this huge war chest. He's shown he can fundraise. He's, for lack of a better, he is a pretty charismatic. He knows how to put on a good speech. He's gone into the Lion's Den. He's gone on Fox News. He's done a lot of interviews and stuff like that. So, he's setting himself to run for presidents. I mean, I always laugh when they show videos of him like cleaning up garbage on the side of the road because I'm like, oh, this is great presidential footage that you're going to run in 2028. This is assuming that obviously Kamala doesn't win right now, but he's a shrewd politician, and regardless of his record, he's going to be able to woo a lot of voters just based on his charisma. I mean, we're seeing that right now with Kamala in a sense of like, if you have enough media behind you and the the establishment and the machines behind you, you can make anyone look amazing, like the second coming of JFK or Barack Obama. So, you know, I wouldn't count him out based on just, a recall or his record. I think he'll be able to rise above that and make a presidential run.
He's having the way paved for him with that right now in exactly what you just said. And I come from the media training side of campaigns and from politics, and he knows how to turn it on. It is something to see. So I think that you're absolutely right, and appreciate your take on that. California is a fabulous state. It's
Hmm.
beautiful. It is, in a lot of respects, successful and has been successful. It feeds the nation. It's got an enormous and booming tech industry that holds up national and international markets. It's thriving in so many ways, but it has so many issues, and issues that have worsened over the last several years, and certainly during Gavin Newsom's term as governor. I mean, those are just numbers. we look at purely facts. One of the biggest issues that is one that has worsened is homelessness. And now we've just heard from the Supreme Court. It's Grants Pass v. Johnson, which essentially made it easier for communities to fine or ticket people living, as they call, unsheltered, even if there are no shelters or places for them to go. In response to that, California saw Newsom do something he has not done in the past several years. There's been a lot of talk about the homelessness problem and cleaning up homelessness. He recently threatened local officials to clean up homelessness or lose funding. So California is home to a third of the nation's unhoused people. And in the past year or two, it has spent over $20 billion allegedly addressing homelessness. It rose 6% last year. What is your take on the history of this horrific problem, really? Because you drive downtown in any major city in California and you see it looks like a third world country. It's devastating. All of the money spent, I'm not sure anyone knows where it's gone. The problem's increasing, and now all of a sudden this Supreme Court ruling comes down, and there is the photo op of Governor Gavin Newsom with his work gloves on, cleaning up trash, supposedly cleaning out a homeless encampment, and all of a sudden it's gone, and he's threatening leadership in other counties and cities to clean it up. What do you think about this?
Yeah, it's well, they'd been using the previous case out of Idaho as an excuse for many, many years in terms of why they can't clean up homelessness. And then the Supreme Court comes in with this Grants Pass case, says we're going to overturn that. This is not cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. And now that excuse is gone. So now you have no excuse. You can't say it's all because of that previous Supreme Court case out of Idaho. Well, it's not Supreme Court, excuse me. It was a Ninth Circuit case that they overturned, coming out of Idaho. And now they actually have to do something about it. And homelessness is absolutely probably the most glaring issue that people come across every single day here in California. I mean, I see it downtown when I work, and I'm walking to the gym or I'm walking to work, and you're passing by people who are screaming bloody murder because they are strung out on some sort of drug, whether it's meth or fentanyl or something. They're not in their right mind. And like it's sad to see sort of the huge dystopian kind of world we live in California, where there's such abject poverty on our streets, and then there's enormous wealth going on in the same exact downtown location. Um, but a lot of these politicians, I think, know that homelessness really is concerning to a lot of Californians. It's not only the fact that like it's an eyesore to a lot of people who say, "Oh, I want my cities to look beautiful." I think people genuinely feel bad for homeless. I think they feel bad, like, why are there so many homeless? And then it becomes an issue of safety when people are not in their right minds and they're not paying attention, they don't know what's going on. People fear for their safety if they're walking downtown in LA or San Francisco or San Diego and people are acting out of their mind. You don't know what's going to happen in terms of your own safety. So I think that's an issue that a lot of politicians here are definitely grappling with. And yeah, Gavin Newsom is going to get the photo op. He's going to show that he's cleaning up, whatever tiny little underpass, but that's such like a small amount. But going back to sort of what we were talking about before, I think this is going to this whole there's a swell of change going on in California, whether people see it or not. I think there is this sort of swell of people trying to move back towards the middle a little bit more. Um, I know, crazy. I know a lot of people are probably saying, how does California move back towards the middle? But you're seeing it. You're seeing it in San Francisco. You're seeing San Francisco, London, Mayor London Breed, who's out there. She's cleaning up homeless encampments. She's sending out police to start cleaning up homeless encampments. She's taking a hard stance on crime. She was a big supporter of ballot measures there in San Francisco to increase powers and surveillance, and being able to chase down criminals. I mean, she's been tough on crime because her city is obviously struggling. Gavin Newsom has to move towards the middle if he ever wants to run for president. To your point about the 24 billion, you have Phil Chen, who is a assembly member from the Bay Area. We showed a video on our podcast of him grilling officials from the Newsom administration who were supposed to show up and explain, like, where did any of this $24 billion go? And, these two workers showed up and they had no answer. And here you have a Bay Area Democrat grilling them. Where's the money? How am I supposed to go back to my constituents and tell them we lost 24 billion? Sorry, give us more money. And it was also interesting that they were able to get Prop 1 this year on the ballot before the audit came out because they knew there was an audit on homeless spending coming down the pike sooner or later. So Prop 1, if you don't remember, this was back towards the midterms. Prop 1 was the proposition for us to authorize the state taking a $6 billion bond. It'll end up costing the taxpayers about probably 10 billion with interest over time. So voters, it was very, very narrow. It was very close. I think it was a few 100,000 votes. Not very, it wasn't a runaway, but voters approved it. Now, I think if they had put that on the November ballot and then this audit came out showing we lost $24 billion and we have no idea where it is, Prop 1 probably would have been resoundingly defeated. So that was a political move on their part to get that passed. Um, so it's definitely an issue that people are trying to grapple with and trying to figure out. But to me, homelessness is, I think a lot of what they're doing right now, it's kind of like trying to put a band-aid on like an axe wound. And what I mean by that is like homelessness, I think, is a symptom of a larger problem in California is it's really, really hard to live here. It's very unaffordable to live here. And if you're living paycheck to paycheck and you have no savings and you have no money, and then all of a sudden you lose your job and you can't make rent, you're all of a sudden homeless. You don't know where to go. And this is sort of how it starts is people can't thrive, people can't prosper in California. And when you make a state incredibly unaffordable, yeah, you're going to have more people who end up on the streets because they can't afford to live here and they have nowhere to go. Um, So I think them trying to build shelters or do all this other stuff, yeah, it helps, but at the end of the day, you kind of have to look at what's the root problem here. The root problem is California is really unaffordable to live in, and it puts a lot of people in these horrible positions where one bad month and all of a sudden they're out on the streets and now they've joined the homelessness. And that's really what a majority of the stories you see are that's the story is that they lost their home, they were kicked out of their apartment, they don't know where to go. Um, drugs are definitely a part of it, but yeah, it's definitely something that California has to figure out soon.
Hmm. Phil, do you think that the California voters are making that connection between these props that they're voting for that sound so good? They name them the most positive, rainbows and butterflies names, like let's save kids and let's shelter the unsheltered, and even aside from the state squandering all of that, do you think that the voters are understanding what it is going to cost them in increased taxes? Because that is how it is going to be paid for. These bonds that the state is taking out, it translates to more taxes for California residents and less money to put into that cost of living in California pot for every family. Or when voters are filling out this ballot and these props sound so needed and great, like, wow, the state of California is really working for the people to make everything better. Do you think that connection's being made?
Um, Unfortunately, I think their deceptive titles do work. If you look at several years ago, there was a ballot to repeal the gas tax. And the way they had worded it was deceptive enough where people voted no when they're supposed to vote yes, that they wanted to repeal the gas tax. And that's an example of how they can be very deceptive with that. And every year, it's always an issue of, well, we get this prop, we work very hard, we get something on the ballot, we get the signatures, it gets cleared by the Secretary of State, goes to the Attorney General, and then whoever the Attorney General is decides, oh, this is going to be the name of this proposition, and you really can't do anything about it. Some courts have kind of pushed back on it that you can't be that deceptive. I mean, like you can't say, free education for all when it's really like a ballot measure to increase taxes and pay for legislators. They are very clever on how they name it. And a lot of people, I don't know, I tell all my listeners, take your time. Like, take your time reading these ballots, read the arguments for, read the arguments against, see who supports it, who doesn't support it. Does your party support it? I mean, look at it from a whole bunch of different angles because even if you're informed, maybe you can inform somebody else, which is really important. They make it deceptive on a purpose so that they can get this stuff passed. It's kind of like with Prop One. They made it sound
Mhm.
great. We want to help solve homelessness. We want to do all this stuff. Oh, just sign off on taking out a $6 billion loan, put it on a credit card, and we'll pay it back later. And unfortunately, it does work like that. And it's always, I mean, the formula gets kind of like laughable at a certain point. It's always the same thing. We need to do this for first responders and for school children and puppy dogs and to your point, like it's always like they throw in the certain amount of buzzwords of like, well, what do you hate, firefighters? Or you don't want to vote for this because you hate firefight. What do you hate, school children? Like, how can you vote again? And then when you look at the proposition, you're like, how much of this money is going to school children? They're like 2%.
Right.
But what? You hate school children? You don't want them to get that money? And it's like, yeah, they can be pretty deceptive. So, that's why actually this upcoming week we're doing a podcast literally going through every proposition. We try to go through every proposition before the election on our podcast just to kind of break down for people like what's going on in this proposition. What do I need to know about this? Should I vote yes or no? My general rule of thumb is like whenever I see the words, this proposition will authorize the state to take out a bond, I
Hmm.
stop there and I automatically vote no because there's no reason for California to be taking on more debt that we can't pay for.
Well, that's really good that you're doing that. And I want to encourage everyone to be following and listening to your California Underground podcast. I want to talk to you about a few of the better known bills and props that are coming forward. And just for obviously for people who are in California, but really this affects everyone. And if it's not happening in your state now, if some of these things get passed, and California is really good at continuing to put things forward until they do pass, it might be coming to your state soon. So I do want to go through some of these more kind of better known bills and props. Now, the California legislature has about less than 2 weeks to essentially go through and vote on 1,300 bills. So,
And we're going to cover them all right now.
hang on, go get something to eat, take a break. Okay.
We'll be back.
I know you've been talking about AB 1955. You just mentioned it. This is a big one. It's making national news for good reason. It essentially bans schools from notifying parents about students' gender or sex if that changes. That's a very simplified explanation of what this bill is about. Maybe you can give our listeners a little bit more detail about what AB 1955 is trying to accomplish.
Yeah. So basically, this all started because there was a school, Chino Valley Unified, who had passed this ordinance with their school board that said if a child comes out to the teachers or administrators and says, I'm identifying, if they're a boy and they say I'm identifying as a girl now, the new ordinance required that administrators and teachers would have to notify the parents to be like, okay, we just want to let you know your child is now identifying as the opposite gender. That became a huge issue of contention with people in Sacramento. Gavin Newsom made a big deal about it. Tony Thurmond, who is now announced he's running for governor in 2026, made a big deal. He showed up at Chino Valley at their school board to vote his opposition or say his opposition. Attorney Rob Bonta worked on suing the school. And basically, they made a huge deal about it. And they then passed AB 1955, which bans local school boards from doing this, which means that if you are a local citizen and you vote for your school board and you say, I want them to uphold these policies or these ordinances, Sacramento said, no, we don't want you to have local control. We don't want you to have local representation. You have to abide by what we want. It's the top down mentality coming from Sacramento. And this really kind of, there's two big aspects of AB 1955, which kind of send shivers down your spine. One is the issue that Sacramento has effectively said, we get to co-parent with you through our public schools and through government funded institutions. We are going to co-parent your child with you, meaning if we decide that it's not worth it to tell you what's going on with your child at school, that's up to the government and we get to hold that secret from you. There was an interesting video we had on our show when we did this. It was when this was going through committees, people are allowed to testify. So people are allowed to show up to these committee hearings. They're open to the public. People can show up and give testimony or make a statement about it. And this one person came up and she was a self-avowed progressive Democrat. She was also a teacher. And she came up and she was vehemently against AB 1955. And she kept saying, look, I'm a progressive Democrat. Even my son went through this himself. And it turned out, we did talk therapy, we worked with him, and he grew out of it. And that was the end of it. But we wouldn't be able to do that if I didn't know that my son was going through this and you're holding this secret from me and we weren't able to help him. And as a teacher, she was saying, now you're making us involuntary co-conspirators to keep secrets from parents at school. So now you have this idea, well, what are teachers and administrators at school doing? And we had someone last week, Alex Balkian, who is running for Congress. And as a gay man, he said, look, they're conflating this issue of outing children who are gay or trans issues or gender identity, which are not the same thing. And he was trying to say they're trying to conflate it because it obviously gets more support that way. But in terms of you're trying to conflate two different things. So that whole issue is probably really controversial that the schools are stepping in, or at least government is stepping in. Sacramento saying, we get to co-parent with you. We get to figure out what we do and do not tell your children. The other thing that I think is most terrifying goes back to this idea of California has 58 counties. It's an enormous state. And when you think about what is the difference between San Diego County and Orange County and Inyo County and San Joaquin County, I mean, and then there's counties all the way up in the state of Jefferson. I can't name probably more. Humboldt County, is Humboldt County one of them? You think about the massive differences in all these counties and these localities, and Sacramento just always wants to pass this one size fits all, top down mentality, some crazy kooky idea cooked up from a Bay Area politician like Scott Wiener, and they try and apply it to the whole state, and it doesn't work. And you had said before, when you look at the electoral map of California, you do notice there is a ton of red outside of the city. So when they say, oh, we're just going to apply this Bay Area idea to all of California, then you're not letting people have that local representation. Then it's like, well, what's the point of having local representation? Why have a school board? Why have county supervisors? Why have a city council? You know, if Sacramento wants to run everything and King Newsom wants to run everything, then why don't they just run everything? So there's a lot of issues with AB 1955, and I know Chino Valley is already suing the state over it. So we'll see where that goes. But it's probably one of the most shocking and eye-popping bills that has been passed in California in the past couple of years. It would definitely be out there, top three, in my opinion.
It's getting a lot of national play, as it should. And I was kind of remiss before in having you explain the difference between what these bills we're talking about, an assembly bill, AB, or a Senate bill, SB, or a proposition, and what the voting public gets to weigh in on and how they do that, right? The public gets a voice just in different ways, right? We vote on
Yeah.
propositions, but bills make their way up to Sacramento through a process. Maybe you can just break that down really quickly, just so that people understand, okay, we have an AB 1955 situation, which probably a lot of people want to voice their opinions on, and what's their avenue to do that?
Yeah, I found that the best way and the most successful way in the past several years that stops bills from getting passed is literally just calling your local representatives. I mean, the one thing you can always, the golden rule of politicians that you can always rely on is that politicians always want to hold on to power. And if they fear that something is making them unpopular, that maybe they might lose their next election, they might change their tune on something. And there's been a good amount of bills that I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head, based on public opposition, would fail or would die in committee or would not make it to the floor. That's probably the best way to do it. Literally calling up your office. And it sounds kind of dumb to be like, I actually have to call the office. Yeah, they listen to voicemails. And if there's 400 voicemails from constituents who are pissed off about a bill, they might all of a sudden go, maybe this bill isn't such a great idea. Maybe I should not support this bill. Maybe I should try to kill it or put it in a suspense file. So when it comes to like those types of bills, so you have AB, which AB and SB are just kind of denominators of where the bill started. So if a senator started it, it gets SB. If an assembly person starts it, it's AB. The best way to think about this too, in terms of our state legislature, to compare it to U.S. politics is, U.S. politics, we have the Senate, same thing. We have a Senate here, and then the Assembly is basically our House of Representatives. So that's the best way I have found is actually just calling them, literally calling them and telling them a whole story of like why you oppose this. And if enough people call, like people will back off of it. The legislature can also propose propositions. So if the legislature comes together and says, we want to put this proposition on the ballot and have the people vote on it, because there are some things they have to actually have us vote on. Some tax increases and tax spending have to have us vote on, part of the California Constitution. So there are propositions. Not every proposition you see is a proposition that was put on strictly by the people. It could have been put on by the legislature. So there are ways to hold a lot of these elected officials accountable. Obviously, voting them out and flipping seats is one way as well, which we saw with Alberto Gil, who just switched and flipped seats or flipped her party. My opinion's still out on her, whether or not she did it for all the right reasons, but we'll see about that. We're trying to get her on the show to try and explain a little bit more. But yeah, I think that's probably one of the best ways is just voice your opposition. because a lot of these politicians don't want to get voted out and they don't want to lose to somebody. Um, and again, I think a lot of people are going to say, well, there's no way a Democrat will lose to a Republican in California. Maybe, but will that Democrat lose to a more moderate Democrat in California's open jungle primary? That's what it comes down to. So they could be primaried by someone who's more moderate within their party. Just something to think about.
There was research done about what does make opposition to or public input have an effect on someone in political leadership. And what it found was the threshold was 50 emails, 50 phone calls on a certain issue, and someone in a position of leadership will pay attention to it. So that's nothing. I mean, you can get a
Yeah.
book club together to send a few emails out and say, hey, we don't agree with this. We need to reach out. And so I'm with you on that. I think it's much easier than people realize to pick up the phone and call your elected representative, because that's their job. They represent
Mhm.
you. They need to talk to you and hear from you and give you the respect of their time to hear from their constituents. So I'm with you there. And speaking of these bills that have to do with government control of the raising of children and their education, there's been a lot of talk, a lot of discussion about curriculum. So another one of these bills that's sort of hotly contested right now is this AB 1825, having to do with what's in public libraries. Is that one that you guys are discussing on your show?
We haven't discussed it yet. Probably a good topic to discuss. But again, this kind of comes back to this whole AB 1955. It comes back to local control. If local representatives, again, I'm a big fan of localization. That's my belief. I'm a big fan of decentralization and localization. People 800 miles away or however far they are don't know what's going on in some of these counties. They're not here on the ground. They don't see it firsthand. They don't live in the city. I mean, I know we live in the world of internet and you can literally be anywhere around the world all at the same time. But there's a difference of like if you live in a community, if you live in a city, you see it every day, you experience it, as opposed to living 800 miles away and thinking this is the best idea ever. Everybody needs to do it. I'm a big fan of localization. I know what's best, or I don't. I'm not going to say I know what's best for San Diego, but I know what's going on in San Diego enough to say this is what we should be doing. These are the real issues. This is the real intricacies, rather than someone hundreds of miles away. So this is going back to, I forget what school or where it was. I think it was Huntington Beach. Again, it was this sort of local control where people in that community said, "Hey, this is what we want you guys to do. We don't want this material available to children." And so what Huntington Beach did, and again, I think it's Huntington, I'm pretty sure it's Huntington Beach. Huntington Beach basically said, okay, we're going to move all this material away from the children's section. We're going to move it into its own section where only adults can get to it. And there was this whole freak out. There's this whole freak out that like children shouldn't be, why can't children open these sexually explicit books that talk about sexual orientation and all of this stuff? And that's a Sacramento Bay Area kind of ideal of like, well, why can't children read sexually explicit material? And then people in Huntington Beach were going, I think that's kind of a stupid question that you're even asking that. Again, it comes back to this. Sacramento doesn't like local control. They don't like the fact that, yes, whether you like it or not, conservatives do exist in the state of California. In fact, millions of them exist here in the state of California. Fun fact, actually, I think more people voted for Donald Trump, more Republicans voted for Donald Trump in California in 2020 than any other state. So just throwing that out there. But yeah, I think Sacramento, it just drives them nuts. The fact that there are conservatives in the state who do things on their own, they do things at the local level, and they don't like that. They want everything to be exactly like San Francisco. So they stamp down on it. And so this AB 1825 basically says, no, you can't do this anymore. You can't, segregate these books. You have to make them available to all children. If you want to put something out, you have to send it into the state librarian, which I learned that there was a state librarian. Um, and they have to approve your plan of how you're going to organize your books, which obviously a state librarian, I think we all know which way they're going to lean. Again, so it's more of this, they keep taking away local control of how people want to govern their communities. I think that's going to end up hurting them in the long run in terms of how it's viewed that Sacramento won't let people just locally control their own communities.
The removal of local control, but also the removal of parental rights, right? And transparency. So 1825, but also based on AB 1078 that Newsom signed, that prohibited school boards from banning books because they had this subject matter that dealt with race or sexuality just generally. So it's just
Mhm.
so interesting. Anytime you as a parent or a concerned citizen see any kind of legislation coming down that is trying to take information away or hide, remove
Mhm.
transparency or exposure from things that have to do mostly with kids, is such a red flag. So I encourage people to continue to look into those and really know what's happening and reach out to your elected officials if you have some thoughts on that.
Mhm.
This one, we got a couple props coming up in California that, again, they're extraordinarily expensive. Bond issues, again, Prop 2 and Prop 4, they're each going to cost $110 billion, billion with a B. One is school related. One amount of that 110 billion is going to schools. One $110 billion chunk is going to climate, going to the climate. Paid back
Mhm.
over time with interest, that equates to $650 million a year for 30 years.
Mhm.
Arguments against this say that additional funding from Prop 4 is not even needed to improve water and fire prevention infrastructure in the state, and can be instead addressed by change in policy, but that they're going to use it to backfill debt, potentially line pockets of Newsom's friends on the new and Green New Deal side. We were talking earlier about how this works in the state, that the state borrows this money. It costs so much over time. I did some digging on this Prop 4 and what this is going to go to. This insane amount of money is going to go um, to try to affect the climate in California. And some of it's like cooling centers. I mean, it's just a ton of money, Phil. What do you think about this? I mean, the state of California used to have a surplus, and now it's in somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 70 billion dollars in debt. And here we're trying to ask the voters to vote on a bond to take 110 billion dollars for the climate. I'm very interested in your thoughts on this.
Well, if there's three industries in the state of California where you can make a ton of money, it's definitely homelessness. If you want to be the CEO of a nonprofit that tackles homelessness, you can make up to $500,000 a year. Climate change, obviously, is another good one. And anything involving education, public education, like the teachers' unions, you're going to make a ton of money. And they then turn around and donate this money back to Democrats who just repeat the cycle over and over again, where they pass more bills and take out more debt for us to pay for that fills up their coffers. I'll say this: I am in favor of us doing what we need to do for the environment, but also not at the cost of $500 million. I don't think you can spend your way to a cleaner planet. um, I mean, California leads the way in a lot of things. And yes, we had Tesla for a while until Gavin Newsom scared off Elon Musk with AB 1955, and Tesla changed the world when it came to electric vehicles. Um, but I think we have to be realistic in the fact that there are incremental changes we can take for the climate that don't require hundreds of millions and billions of dollars to pay for. One of my biggest things, we have a shirt on our store that says "Help stop brownouts, support nuclear." And the fact that we don't support nuclear, this has always been my big thing. You know, if you're for zero carbon energy that puts off zero carbon and is incredibly powerful, if you don't start your conversation with "we need to look at nuclear as a serious solution," I'm not taking you seriously. I'm sorry. You're not, if you're serious about climate change and zero carbon and all that stuff, and you don't want to talk about nuclear power, then I'm not going to take you seriously because it is the most powerful zero carbon, best renewable energy we have on the planet. Um, and that's not my words. That was previously President Barack Obama's energy secretary's own words, where he said that's the best zero carbon fuel we have on the planet. We have just a couple here in California. It's been my idea or my position that California should ramp up safe nuclear energy. We're the state of technology. We're the state of innovation. Why are we not creating better nuclear reactor plants? We could have four or five and be supplying energy to the entire West Coast and be exporting it and then filling the state's coffers that way and making a ton of money. Um, but there's practical things we could be doing in California that makes a difference. Now, does it make an overall difference to the globe in general? I mean, compared to California, what we do doesn't really make a difference between China and India, what they're doing, but at least maybe we set the tone in technology and practices that people can follow. But the one thing you can't do is you can't spend your way into a better climate. I saw a meme the other day that was like, I can make the weather change if you just keep giving me more tax dollars. When you put it like that, you're kind of like, yeah, that is pretty idiotic. We're kind of we have politicians now, and maybe this is really at the root of all of our political issues. We have politicians now who are so narcissistic about themselves and so power hungry that they believe that they can literally change the weather with taxing people. Like that's where we're at in society, is that politicians quite literally might believe they are demigods on earth, that they can change weather by passing more taxes. Um, will people end up voting for it in California? Probably, because they'll be named like the Safe, Clean Water and Love for Puppies and First Responders Act or something like that. So yeah, we can't spend our way into climate change. We can take practical actions that could help with climate change, but
Yeah,
spending
the
is
name of it
definitely not there.
sounds amazing. The name sounds like we're gonna completely remake our entire state into the cleanest, healthiest,
Mhm.
safest state on the planet. What do you think the resistance is to nuclear? Do you think it's because it literally sounds really scary? Or do you think that people just don't understand what it is? Because our carbon emissions right now and what the state of California is doing in terms of energy production and bringing it in from other nations and bringing in oil, and the carbon
Mhm.
emissions are through the roof,
Mhm.
but nobody's talking about that. So if we have this good option and the plants are already in the state, what do you think the resistance is to switching over and relying on nuclear?
I mean, I think yeah, you probably look at Chernobyl and Fukushima and those issues that still resonate with people's minds, even though I think when you look back, those were mostly human error. Those weren't systems errors. And so I think people are hesitant towards that. But it's kind of like, Gavin Newsom put out this edict that in 2035, they're going to ban the sale of internal combustion engines in California. They've already tried banned internal combustion engines for lawnmowers and stuff like that. And you kind of step back and you go, okay, well, how are we going to power all of these new electric cars that you want us to drive by 2035? Mind you, he'll be long out of office by that time. So my money is on that this will probably get kicked down the road several times before they even try and implement it, if they even do implement it. But they're trying to do this across the board in terms of electric vehicles. They're trying to get trucks like that deliver our food to be all electric, which there is literally no technology for that right now. But California is like, nope, you got to do it. You got to have electric trucks if you want to deliver your goods into California. So if you think groceries are expensive now, wait until there's no trucks coming into California to deliver your groceries. But again, goes to that issue of like you can't, I can't take you seriously if you want to tell everybody, okay, we all need to go to electric vehicles because it's better for the environment. Okay, well, what are we doing to fix the grid and how are we going to get more power? We don't really have an answer for that besides building 1 bajillion solar panels that don't do anything. And instead, you could build in, or I mean, you could reopen a couple of nuclear power plants right now and have more than enough energy to power a lot of this stuff. So I think a lot of resistance is is likely due to probably the incidents that happened in the past, even though I mean, we still have a nuclear reactor right now that's working in California, and people don't seem to really be that worried about it. And to your point about, and it comes to energy here in California, we have an enormous amount of oil right under our feet. And if California struggles with gas prices, which struggles with energy prices, which struggles with the cost of goods and affordability, why do we import so much from third world countries? Why wouldn't it behoove us to say, okay, well, we can open up our refineries and our wells here, and at least we can keep an eye on it here and make sure the workers are making a good wage, they're protected, they have workers' rights, and we make sure that it's doing it in the most environmentally sound way. Same with the refineries, and we can produce our own oil, and then gas could be cheap here in California, which would help your everyday Californian. But no, let's just instead import it from, third world countries like Ecuador, thousands of miles away. We have to ship it by big steamboats. So, which is not good for the environment as well. So let's
No,
buy
Phil, it's
gas from thousands
fine.
away.
It's fine.
Well,
That doesn't
what do we
affect the
always say?
climate.
Any
Ugh.
pollution that happens outside of California
Oh, do we
doesn't
not count
count.
it?
So we don't
Okay.
count it. It doesn't get
It's
counted.
fine.
So
It's fine. Don't see it, not our
don't
problem.
see it. Nope.
Yep.
Yeah,
That's totally
exactly.
fine. Well, I want to ask you about a couple more things. We're running a little bit short on time, but I just want to touch quickly on Prop 5, only because this, for me personally, just irritates the stink out of me about how hard California has tried in the past to remove residential property tax
Mm,
protections and limits. I mean, this Prop 13, it's the removal of Prop 13 they've been aiming at. Is that right? Do I have that right? Prop 13 set the limit for
right.
residential property tax, and they've been at it for years trying to get that removed. It won't pass because it's a 2/3 threshold. And so
Right.
Prop 5 is going to lower the vote threshold to 55% if it gets voted through. And then they're going to come back at Prop 13 again. I mean, they've tried it through the side door of commercial real estate. So if they can uncap taxes on commercial real estate, then they think they have a side door into raising taxes residentially. Any thoughts quickly on Prop 5 from your end?
Yeah, I mean, it's not new. They've been chipping away at Prop 13 for 40 years, 40 plus years now. It's because it's the last frontier of taxation for California. I mean, they tax literally everything here in California, and property taxes are the one thing. Funny enough, I remember watching the debate between, I think it was DeSantis and Newsom, and he made the point very proudly that, when you compare taxes in Florida to taxes in California, oh my gosh, look at, our property taxes are some of the lowest in the country and blah, blah, blah. And he's touting how low the property taxes are in California. And then you go, wait a second, but you and your ilk have been trying to get rid of Prop 13 for about 40 years now. Yeah, they've been trying to chip away at Prop 13 because it's the last frontier, and it's the last place they can start to really rake in a lot of money for the state, which would go to fund a lot of these crazy programs like spending money to change the weather. Um,
But who could live
so
here? Who could afford higher
right,
property when property values are so inflated? They're so high in California. I mean,
yep,
you can't find a mobile home for barely under $1 million. I'm not being facetious. It's
no, it's
shocking.
very
So if
scary.
you're raising property taxes on $1 million home up what 8, 10, 12, 14%, no
Yeah.
one can survive that.
Well, here's a good analogy that we as Californians deal with all the time. How much is your car registration every year? They base that off value. So if you have a newer, nicer car, you could be paying $500-$600 a year just for your car registration. Now apply that to your house. And if they're going to be raising it based on the value and it's not capped at 1%, imagine what your property taxes are going to be every year based on the perceived value of your house. And it's going to put a lot of people who have their homes right now, it's going to put a lot of people, they won't be able to afford those homes anymore. There might be a mass exodus. So the middle class could be completely gone. The people who work in California, the people who pay a live in California, the people who make up California could be heading towards the exit really quickly because they'll lose their homes if they don't. So it's one of those things where I don't think they realize the catastrophic uh, consequences of what happens if you do get rid of Prop 13. And a lot of these houses are then taxed based on their value. You will see a mass exodus. You will see a lot of people leave California, and there won't be enough people to work and keep this economy going. But their obsession with finding
Mm.
every way to tax you and to bring in more and more money because they have these outlandish ideas of what they need to do to run your life and control your life. That's California for you. So would it be the final straw that really kind of turns California around if they got rid of Prop 13? It might be. A lot of people are like, when do we hit rock bottom in California? Getting rid of Prop 13 might be hitting rock bottom. That might be where people go, yep, I'm out, or we need to have a massive, political revolution. And revolution in terms of like nonviolent revolution, post January 6th, you always have to say stuff like that just in case. Um, I mean, revolution at the ballot
I'm not going to
box
rat you
where we
out,
st
Phil.
you never
Yeah.
know. Someone might take it out of context down the
Say
road and
what you
be like,
want. Say what you want. Well,
remember that Phil guy? He said he wants a revolution.
if the FBI
But
is not coming for you, the UK is coming for you. Okay, you
yeah,
can't say that. But then if you keep the revolution here, it's fine. They don't want you inciting it overseas. No, I actually think that removal of Prop 13 would be the one blow that the state of California could not survive, because you keep saying losing a home. Well, you'd lose it, but there's no way you'd be able to sell it. Who's coming in
right.
to buy a home that now has a complete lift on any restriction on property tax? Everyone's devastated. Nobody
Mhm.
survives that. You could leave, but you're leaving with nothing. You want a homelessness problem. That's going to do it right there. I think that God help California if they ever take Prop 13 out. I do think that's the bomb getting dropped, that people in the state would not survive. So I really hope people
Mhm.
are paying attention to how they are trying to get that accomplished. Pay attention to Prop 5, vote wisely, pick up the phone, email, say something about that, because I just don't think that one's survivable. But really quickly, while I've got you, I want to talk about one more bill that's also getting a lot of attention, that's concerning to a lot of people, which is SB 94, which reduces sentences for felons who've been in custody for 25 or more years. I'd like to know, please help me understand this and make it make sense. What's
Mhm.
the benefit for Californians or for the United States in an early release bill like this? Are there too many people in prisons? I know the prisons are overcrowded, but are they including violent criminals in this consideration? I read that it's early release if they've only killed two people.
Right.
I'm a little confused about this one. Please
Yeah,
help me make this one make sense.
if you're getting sentenced to prison for 25 years or more, you've done a horrible, horrible crime to society. This is not, we're talking about vandalism or theft or something like that. We're talking about, like you said, killing someone, like taking a life. And the idea of letting anybody out after that is hard to fathom. And California is this whole soft on crime notion has sort of put a lot of these politicians on their heels. The interesting debate over what's going on with Prop 47 and Prop 36, which seeks to reform Prop 37, how many times they tried to kill Prop 36 and how many times they tried to get rid of it or pass poison pill laws. And now all of a sudden, because it's slated to be on the ballot in November, you've seen a lot of Democrats who are quietly going, oh, yeah, we've always supported Prop 36. We want to be tough on crime too, kind of like London Breed in San Francisco. Again, this is one of those utopia crazy ideas. I forget who the author was, but I could probably guess it's someone like a Buffy Wicks or a Scott Wiener or somebody like that, who believes this is what we need is to let a lot of these people out. And even if you've committed horribly heinous crimes like taking a life, you should be let back out. But we have a lot of issues like that in California. I mean, we like I said, we had Andrew Hayes on a couple weeks ago. And he was talking about the issues of letting sexual predators back into the community, letting them live at like near local bus stops where children are, back into the communities where they committed their crimes. Like California is upside down on crime, it just seems like. And From my personal experience, I was an extern at the district attorney's office down here in San Diego when Prop 47 passed, and I remember listening to all the assistant DAs grumble about Prop 47 and say this is going to screw up the state. This is so bad for the state. People were being let out, people were being let back on the street. People were having charges dropped, and it was just a nightmare for California in terms of low level retail theft, a lot of these low level crimes of letting people back out onto the street to commit more crimes. And California really struggles with an issue of crime here. So, um, will this, this is one that people should probably be calling up, for the safety of your communities. Definitely start calling your representatives to say, let's kill this bill as fast as possible. We don't want these people released back into our communities. Um, but it is one of those utopian ideas where they think it's a good idea. We call a lot of these bills, my co-host and I, we call these the feel good bills. This is what makes politicians feel good, like they pat themselves on the back and think they're all noble and righteous for passing this, but they are the people who never have to deal with the consequences. They live in gated communities far, far away from all this stuff, but they get to pat themselves on the back and make themselves feel good by thinking that they did this utopian idea. So yeah, definitely call up your local elected officials and go out there and try and stop this as fast as possible.
Absolutely. And that is exactly the point that we can end on today is use your voice. We each have our own civic duty, but our own authority to make decisions about what we think on these proposals, the props, the bills, what is going to potentially change for good or for the worse in our communities and in our state. So do what Phil says, pick up the phone, send an email, but make sure your voice is heard regardless of how you feel. That is the best thing that we can all do. And we have the right and the freedom to do it in this country, which we cannot take for granted too. So Phil, I'm so grateful to you for the education and awareness that you are providing to your listeners and today to mine. So thank you so much for being on the show today. And I hope to have you back because there's so much to talk about. We didn't even get to all of it today, but really appreciate your time today. And I hope that you'll join me again in the future on Politically Basic.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, and look forward to coming back.
And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Politically Basic. We're committed to breaking down the basics so you get to decide. Be sure to check us out at politicallybasic.com and follow us at Politically Basic so you don't miss an episode. And we'll see you next time.